So that's a perfect segue. I've got a whole bunch of other names here, but let's put that aside.
Sure.
Because when you sat down, we immediately mentioned a couple of other people that I've done some shows with from Learn Liberty, and Steve Davies came up. And I said to you that when people, probably the number one thing that I get asked is, why do you call yourself a classical liberal instead of a libertarian? And I've said a few times that if I sat down probably with, who would you say is probably the most preeminent libertarian thinker?
Today?
Yeah. Or just give me somebody you like.
Yeah, I mean, online, it tends to be the economists who dominate this conversation. So Brian Kaplan, who you had on a couple weeks ago, runs a very successful blog. Tyler Cowen, I put in that camp. I mean, so somebody like Jason Brennan has gotten a lot of publicity lately for his book Against Democracy. So, I mean, we're shifted out of, I guess, what you might think of as being the 20th century libertarians, Hayek and Friedman and all these kind of guys, and we're moving into, I guess, a new generation of thought. Again, tends to be dominated, I think, by economists, but not necessarily so.
So the question that I get is, well, what makes you a classical liberal as opposed to a libertarian? Now, I sat here with Brian Kaplan a couple weeks ago, and he really, in my opinion, goes really far on that libertarian route, right? But I fully enjoyed the conversation, and I don't agree with him necessarily on some pacifism stuff and some open border stuff and all that. That's all good. But I told you that Steve Davies gave me the best explanation of classical liberalism. So I'm going to link people to two things for now. It's going to be Steve Davies and whatever you're going to say right now. What is the difference between a classical liberal and a libertarian?
And a libertarian. So, I mean, classical liberalism, if I can get my students to reproduce, liberalism is the political ideology of individual rights and limited government. If I can get them to reproduce that, I'm happy. That tends to be enough for me.
But how's that different than libertarianism?
Libertarianism. Well, so libertarianism is relatively big tent. So libertarianism was, in many ways, it was a political movement first, as it were. Libertarians include, I mean, Brian's an anarcho-capitalist, I think. I don't know if you talked about that in the session or not. So it can go, the Brian Kaplan's anarcho-capitalists, I mean, a variety of different sorts of anti-state socialists, all the way up to Bill Weld, essentially. I mean, it's a relatively big tent in that sense, and it's a political movement that I think the idea behind libertarianism seems to be something like reducing both the size and scope of the state. Mm-hmm. So it's, in some sense, it's a political project first, and it tends to really want to resist being attached to some larger moral or cultural doctrine. Whereas liberalism, I really do think that in some sense liberalism was linked up to some conception of the good life, some conception of rationality, some conception of a work ethic. Right. So in other words, I think classical liberalism extends a bit further down, as it were, from the political than libertarianism does.
Yeah, in a weird way, is that the flaw of both of them? That libertarianism became a political party first, so it maybe didn't have the philosophical underpinnings of classical liberalism. Classical liberalism, which was based in philosophy first, maybe doesn't have the root to become a political party, at least in modern day America?
Yeah, so that's
depressing. I hope not.
That's an interesting question. I would say this. I mean, so when we talk about classical liberalism, I mean, this is a function of the way that we talk about ideology. So in other words, you look at Locke, you look at Hume, you look at Smith. None of these guys, even as they produced the liberal tradition, none of them knew they were liberals, right? So in other words, we look back, we said the set of ideas, the doctrines that were produced by this general set of thinkers, this canon, we'll call it, we'll set the lines here, we'll say anyone within this way of thinking, we'll call it liberalism. And there's many ways in which, I mean, so you take even people as chronologically close to one another as Locke and Hume, they disagreed very strongly on a number of different things. So Hume is not a natural rights theorist. Hume is extremely shy on the right of resistance and all this kind of stuff. And yet, I think we would say that both of them contributed to something that, looking back, we call the liberal project. So liberalism, I think, tends to be much broader, much bigger than libertarianism. I mean, I would say that today, both major political parties. Well, 10 years ago, I would say both major political parties in America would fit within the tradition of liberalism, broadly understood. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, very few people are running around today saying we ought to suspend, rights of due process. We ought to suspend free speech or something like that. Very few people are offering what I would consider to be real alternatives to liberalism, whatever whatever those alternatives might be. They might be theocracy. They might be communism. I mean, this, in other words, we seem to have, in some sense, settled on the idea that individuals have claims against the state, that individuals ought to be as free as possible, and all this kind of stuff. And so we, in many ways, we're kind of working out on the margins of that particular view. Libertarianism seems to me as a kind of a smaller political doctrine within that broader thing that we call liberalism.
Yeah, it almost seems to me that if the classical liberals, which I do think are the next political movement here,
Yeah.
we should just hijack the Libertarian Party. I mean, it's such a freaking mess.
Yeah.
Why not just grab this thing? At least they have some of the institutional stuff, right? And grab that and go. Who would you say are in American political history, the politicians that have been closest to real classical liberals? I think the two that probably pop to mind for me would be JFK and New York State Senator Patrick Moynihan. I think probably the most two. Who else? Or do you even agree with those?
Right. I mean, in the liberal tradition, I mean, so generally, I would say, you know, the founding period. These guys. I mean, so somebody like Jefferson, minus the whole slavery business. I mean, Jefferson at least.
But he was freeing the slaves at the same time.
Well, he at least. I'll put it this way. I mean, he articulated the ideas that would absolutely be seized upon by somebody like Frederick Douglass. I mean, Frederick Douglass saying, listen. You know, in this great speech he gives, "What to the slave is the 4th of July," where he says, "Your founding documents are great, they're beautiful, and yet at the same time, what could be further than reality than your founding documents?" So, in other words, I mean, I would say that just generally, men like Madison and Jefferson, these not only were they consistent with what we think of as the classical liberal tradition, but in many ways they contributed to the classical liberal project. In the 20th and 21st century, that's a tougher question. So. I've always thought that. So I grew up in a town called Marion, Ohio, and in Marion, Ohio, we have the Warren G. Harding presidential home. He ran the Marion Star, the newspaper in town. I gave tours there for years. But Harding's idea of normalcy. So Harding was president after Woodrow Wilson. People forget that the Wilson presidency was. I mean, I guess we were reminded of this every once in a while, but it was an absolute mess. We're talking, I mean, just unbelievable American casualties in a completely pointless war, economic catastrophe of a number of sense. And Harding actually ran on what he called, and this is actually where we get the word normalcy, the return to normalcy. And so he was only president for a couple of years. He died in office. I mean, he wasn't a great president by any stretch of the imagination. But just the idea of a restrained role of the presidency, the president as a kind of a steady hand on institutions, that I think is relatively consistent with the liberal tradition. I think for me, a president becomes a threat to the liberal tradition when they see themselves as leading some kind of movement, as being in charge of a vision, as speaking for the people in some meaningful sense. And this is very much what the progressive era was about. So you see this in TR, you see this in Wilson, the idea of the president being, in a kind of strange sort of way, the president, in being a single person, popularly elected, the president can then be the kind of the voice of the people, and the president can, you know, carry the big stick needed to deal with the entrenched interests in Congress and big business and all that kind of stuff. I mean, this was the progressive vision, and I think you see a lot of that rhetoric today on both with Trump and also with Sanders.
Yeah, so Trump, though, is a particularly interesting case of this, right? Because he obviously is that. He thinks he's the guy and the populist and all that. And at the same time, he doesn't care about the social issues, so there's a nice classical liberal feeling of live and let live there. He's trying, I think, you know, even this regulation thing where he's going to strike down 2 regulations for every 1 new one. It's gimmicky, it sounds like a game show, but there's a nice scaling back of the state there. It doesn't sound like we're going to have a lot of adventurous war. All of these things that I think are basically within the tradition of classical liberalism, but he has that other piece. So how do you place him? Because no one, I think, has a good, full, holistic understanding of the guy.
Well, because in a lot of ways, there's very little of him there, right? I mean, the classic line about Trump believes whoever the last person he talked to, you know, whoever was that last persuaded him, and I think a lot of that is true. I don't think he doesn't seem to be a terribly ideological figure. I mean, he in some sense intuitively grasped, in a way that a lot of demagogues historically have, he intuitively grasped in some sense whatever you want to call the people. I mean, it was a very particular set of people. I mean, we're talking about Rust Belt Appalachian voters. I mean, the real red states, and also, I guess, out west. He intuitively grasped what it was that they wanted, what they wanted to hear. And a lot of this didn't have anything to do with policy positions. A lot of it was just listen, these establishment types have been screwing you over for however long, and I'm going to be the one who comes up here and does something about it. I mean, he was the ultimate outsider in an age of outsiders. I mean, there is something a little tiresome about this constant, we need outsiders in Washington, we need outsiders in Washington, all this kind of stuff. But nobody did that quite as well as Trump did. And I mean, so just in the places that I grew up in Ohio, and a lot of my family's from West Virginia, I mean, I could almost immediately, once he began talking, I could say that they're going to love this, where they're tired of being looked down upon and all this kind of thing. Now, when it comes to classical liberal tradition, my own view, I think that Trump is an unmitigated disaster from the classical liberal perspective. And actually, the regulation.
I'm not saying he's a classical liberal. I think he's maybe done some things that we can sort of tolerate.
Right.
But I don't think he has a political philosophy.
He doesn't have. I don't think he has. He definitely doesn't have a kind of a clearly articulated political philosophy or political ideology.
Right.
But he's very good at symbols. He understands symbols quite well. The wall is a really good example. I mean, the wall is not a policy position. Will it actually curtail immigration? I see no reason to think that it will. Most immigrants apparently come over on planes. They overstay visas. They do a number of different things.
Yeah.
Will it have any effect, in other words, on this thing, immigration? Even immigration itself isn't really a policy question. The average person, their view on immigration is not informed by statistics on. I mean, they don't know that net immigration from Mexico is negative. They don't know any of this kind of stuff. I mean, it isn't real to them as a policy or as an empirical question. But they do understand insiders and outsiders, and they do understand what the wall represents in some way. So the wall represents a reaffirmation of the American identity, or the idea of America. And in particular, it represents that reaffirmation by reaffirming the boundary between what is America and what isn't, who is America and who is not. I mean, there's a reason we don't put the ball on the northern border. I mean, in other words, the implications are very clear. But Trump grasped that intuitively. He knew what the wall would mean. And at some level, it doesn't matter if the wall ever gets built. For Trump, the wall was that symbol that he needed to brand. I mean, it was just a big four-letter word that he could sear into the brains of every American. And it worked. It worked tremendously. But it's a really good example of the way that Trump was able to seize on this language, to speak this language without any of the other sort of stuff that you would think would matter. I mean, Hillary Clinton had policy positions out the wazoo, but I mean, nobody wants those.
But nobody cares, which is probably a function of technology and attention spans and all the rest of it.
Right. I mean, part of it is, part of it was policy positions. I mean, she wasn't in a variety of ways. She wasn't a great candidate. But yeah, I mean, so for me, the troubling thing about Trump is partly to do with this idea of the wall. I mean, and to the extent that, in some ways, the cultural politics of the right have crowded out any policy positions that they might have. So, not just the walls, the regulation thing is another example, actually. So for every new regulation, 2 of them get scaled back. So again, it is kind of gimmicky, and there is this kind of individualist, libertarian conception. We don't want regulations. We don't like rules. All this kind of stuff. And yet, at the same time, I mean, it's gimmicky in the sense that pretty soon they'll just figure out that they just put 3 regulations on every single limit. So on the one hand, it won't work.
Right, there's a math thing here, yeah.
And on the other hand, I mean, so it's not clear to me, though, that what libertarians and classical liberals ought to be doing is just a kind of a sort of whole-scale reduction in the state. So a lot of these, you get these reports. X number of institutions he's not making these appointments and all this kind of stuff, and these jobs just aren't going to get left done. It's not clear to me that in the void left by whatever these institutions were, that whatever's going to come in there is going to be conducive to individual liberty. I mean, there's a sense in which when chaos is introduced, when there's a certain amount of disorder, very rarely is it that something like an ordered liberty is the result of that. Usually it's whoever has the loudest voice wins.
Right.
And so I'm afraid at this point, I'm afraid of the loudest voices.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid of the ways in which this kind of brute force approach to scaling back government is going to allow those louder voices to enter into the fray.
What do you make for the argument that I basically buy? Now, I voted for Gary Johnson very begrudgingly.
So you were the one.
I was the one guy. I should be judged accordingly, by the way. I'm not, and he's a perfectly nice guy, and I have had him on the show, and I've chatted with him privately, and, he'd be a great guy to have dinner with, but was a pretty terrible candidate. But what do you make for the argument that I hear people say that Trump's win, forgetting political philosophy, forgetting virtually everything you've said here, that it just shook the system in a way that no one else could have shook it? So if you believed that we had a real problem here. If you know, between a state that was growing and NSA and
Right.
taxes and whatever, foreign policy and all of this stuff that just seems to get bigger and bigger, that he was the only sledgehammer to that.
Right.
Because I think there is some legitimacy to that. It doesn't mean that what's going to come out on the other side is going to be any better. And you might be right that it's just going to bring on louder voices and that this could be the beginning of the end of the republic and all of that stuff. But do you think that there's a legitimacy to that line of thinking?
Oh no, no, absolutely. And be clear. I mean, these now we're verging into the territory of stuff. I mean, when I say I think Trump is this, I think Trump is that. I mean, I want to emphasize that this is what I think. In other words, we're talking about extremely complex systems. I mean, I think it's very difficult. Anyone who says they know what Trump is going to bring about, anyone who says they know this is what's going to happen, that's what's going to happen, I mean, is either speaking from an ideological position or is just trying to get clicks. I mean, so in other words, I have relatively strong views about Trump, and yet I still hold them weakly enough I could be proven wrong.
Yeah.
And this is an intriguing line of thought. This idea that that the American government has kind of taken on this kind of autopilot position where it only grows, it only gets bigger. It never ever recedes, it never scales back, and that the only thing that could ever bring about this scaling back would be a kind of catastrophic moment, right? So, in Trump, in this case, would be I think you said the sledgehammer.
Yeah.
So I'm sympathetic to that view, and there's and if you look at history, right? I mean, you can look at a number of different events. Kind of great historical. They tend to be wars, right, or whatever. That on the one hand, they tend to be terrible when they're happening, and at the same time, because they kind of clear out space for innovation to take place, they kind of clear out space for people to think about the way they live in new ways and all this kind of stuff. They can actually end up having a long-term beneficial effect. And so I'm skeptical of that line of thinking, but I could definitely see how it might happen. I guess I worry about the short term. In other words, I worry about a large-scale war. I mean, I worry about this idea of America being about walls. I worry about this kind of thing in the short term, and I worry that that in some sense we're producing a culture of the right that is going to be hostile to individual liberty for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, I worry about all that stuff too. And just as I said all throughout the election, his moral compass. I mean, if this guy gets into a Cuban Missile Crisis situation, which way is this whole thing going? One other piece of this related to Trump, what about the cult of personality when it comes to all these political philosophies that we're talking about? That here we have a guy that it's really based on that and not the political philosophy.
Right.
How should we view that?
Very warily. I mean, that's
probably all you have to say there.
I mean, the idea of a charismatic leader, right? I mean, most of the great destructive movements of the 20th century were led at some level by a great charismatic leader. And I want to be super clear. I'm not saying Trump is Mao. I'm not saying Trump is Stalin or anything like this. But at the same time, I mean, we can see this. I mean, I'm not. I mean, presumably you have people on your Facebook feed from that watch Fox News or do whatever, and when you go home and you talk to people, and there seems to be this sort of broad willingness to listen. The media itself, they're reporting stories that I have no reason to believe anymore. That the kind of the mainstream narratives that I'm not from the media, but from the universities, that I'm getting from Facebook, that I'm getting from all these sources, I have no reason to believe that these are true anymore. These have been, in some sense, the curtain's been pulled back. Yeah. And I can see that there is some big E, the establishment, right, that has been kind of feeding me these lines for years and years. And now, for the first time, right, Trump was the one who pulled the curtain back, and I can trust him. He has access to all these things. After all, he's president. I can trust him as an authority, not only as an authority in terms of the sort of legal and political authorities that he's been trusted with as president, but I can trust him to shoot straight in some sense. And so once you dig your heels into that position, you kind of close yourself epistemically off from everything else, that's bad. I mean, there are very few examples historically of where that has turned out well.
Does that show you how far we've come, I guess, in the wrong direction in a weird way? Because even right now, as we're taping this, and this is going to go up in a couple days, but as we're taping this whole story about Susan Rice broke and this unmasking of the names and all that, And immediately I saw on CNN, there were like 3 things immediately. Don Lemon, who's been on the show, who's a friend, said, we're not going to give this any credence or something to that effect. Jim Sciutto, another CNN guy, said the same exact thing. And then I think a third CNN guy, I think maybe it was John King, saying this is all nonsense. Something, I'm loosely quoting them. But the more they did that, the more I was like, wait a minute, there probably is something here. So that our trust in the Fourth Estate now is so broken that adds another piece into this whole equation.
Yeah, no, it's a real mess. In some sense, I think it is a function of technology, in the sense that what Twitter and what everyone having a camera in their pockets, what they've allowed us to do is to kind of peer behind the curtain in a number of ways. I think you can look at something like police brutality in a similar sort of way. So, I mean, we'd always kind of known that, particularly if you were black in America, right, that interactions with the police could go south pretty quickly. But now that everybody has a camera that's always on in their pockets, I mean, we're seeing things that we just cannot believe. And once you see the frequency of these sorts of interactions, once you see the sheer injustice of how easy it is for police who do this kind of thing, how easy it is for them to get off and all this kind of stuff. You start to wonder, how widespread is this? Like, I mean, how long has this been going on? I haven't known about this. In other words, you begin to look at this thing, right? You begin to look at American policing. You begin to think, this institution, which even 10 years ago I had some modicum of confidence in, I thought was a reasonably just institution. Now you begin to think, this is a house of lies that I've been told my entire life. And with alternative media, I mean, we're told the same thing. So you were on the Young Turks at some point. It's another Democracy Now! I mean, just YouTube, the way that YouTube offers alternative narratives. I mean, we used to have always had alternative publications, Mother Jones and Reason and all this kind of stuff, but now we have 1 million of them. Now we have entire channels which are dedicated, Fox News being a good example, which conceive of themselves as providing an alternative narrative to what's going on. And so suddenly, right, we're not going to go back to, or whatever Walter Cronkite was accepted as, I mean, that was what was in some sense true. This was a kind of a common epistemic world that we all lived in. Now we're all kind of fractured and off in our own communities. That I think is a real problem, and I don't see for right now, it doesn't seem clear to me how that's going to be pieced back together again. How we're going to be able to begin to start agreeing on very basic facts. Was the president wiretapped or not?
Right.
It's almost as if whatever happens over the course of the next 6 months will be unable to answer that question in a way it's a basic empirical question.
Right, and the hysteria machine and the outrage machine adds to that. So it's not just the technology of it, but when Trump said that thing, when he tweeted that thing about the wiretap, I saw it and I didn't jump to comment immediately because I was like, let me see what happens here. Now it turns out that Obama probably did not order it, but something did happen. Yeah. And this is where then the truth becomes subjective to everybody, because if you're only reading Media Matters and Mother Jones or whatever, you're going to get one thing. If you're only reading Fox and some other Breitbart or whatever, you're only going to get something else, and then we just end up.
I mean, and these publications know. I mean, they know what their job is, right? So the thing comes out, and their job is spin, right? Their job is to say, listen, this is the position that we must take, and so we must find the facts that conform to this particular position. And whatever arguments, whatever kind of backflips we can perform to get into this. I mean, all the better for us. I mean, it's just people are gonna keep clicking on articles. They're gonna keep watching the news and all this kind of stuff. I mean, so in other words, you're right in that on the one hand, it seems like our kind of shared world has become fractured, but the people who are doing the fracture, they have very little incentive to stop. In fact, they have every incentive to keep fracturing, to keep saying that it's us and only us who can offer you the truth about what happened. It's us and only us who can offer you the analysis that's gonna cater to what you want to hear anyway. I mean, that's ultimately, I think that's the other kind of part of all this, is that we don't want to hear like if you watch Fox News, you don't want to hear what they're saying at the Washington Post. If you read the Washington Post, you don't want to hear what they're saying at Fox News. It's uncomfortable for you. These are unpleasant experiences, and if we can, ultimately, I mean, down to the last click, cater our online experiences, why would we introduce discomfort into our? And this actually goes all the way back to John Stuart Mill. I mean, John Stuart Mill described this as it's a painful experience. Arguing with people is painful. Disagreeing with people is painful. Coming to the realization that you might be, heaven forbid, wrong about something. This is unpleasant.
Yeah, so, I'm glad you brought it back to that. Because just to wrap everything up here, it's sort of a nice bow on all this. Is there a moment, do you think, in the last 20 years that we got much worse at that? Because it does seem like it's all gotten worse, and I don't know if it's just the technology part. I know that's obviously a big piece, but do you think anything else maybe culturally happened or something? In America, does it have something to do with 9/11? I mean, I'm just throwing things out there. Like, do you think there was something else too?
I think for the most part, it would seem like a slow creep, right? I mean, these. It seems like it's a dripping, right? It's a constant dripping, drip, drip, drip. Every morning you log on, and it just kind of reinforces the sort of the positions that you've already taken up. And I mean, so that's interesting. I mean, for me, the moment in which I guess the politics became fractured in a way that I previously wasn't aware of, and I was a kid at the time, but was probably during the Clinton impeachment scandal, for a variety of reasons. But it was the way that Gingrich was able to organize resistance against Clinton for the first time, where it was they adopted this kind of outsider pose. I mean, Newt Gingrich is still trying to describe himself as an outsider, as a drain the swamp type. I mean, it's absolutely insane. Actually, the guy's name is Newt. He's a former Speaker of the House, and yet. Drain the swamp is his refrain. I mean, the irony is thick. But for the first time, I mean, and in that case, it seemed to me that that these partisan affiliations, that in some sense the break was fundamental, that they were occupying different spaces, different worlds, and that any compromise between these two parties would be viewed as a betrayal by loyalists. Now, I mean, it's very, very easy to say that, no, that's always been the case. Politics has always been that way. Look at Reagan, look at this, look at that, whatever. But for me, anyway, that was the fundamental moment at which I said, these two groups, something has happened here.
Something's up.
Yeah. And no, but again, it was the cultural politics that the right adopted, I think, in the late 90s that I think that proved particularly pernicious. And it's not as if cultural politics are only that we only have right cultural politics. Both sides have these things. But it was that point, and I think the internet does amplify this to a certain extent. We're not interested in policies, but we are interested in symbols. And we're interested in symbols with cultural cachet. And when we talk politics now, we talk in terms of symbols. I mean, for example, just take something like, take a U.S. soldier, right? So if you're on the right, you tend to refer to them as troops. Right? Support our troops, right? I mean, for whatever reason, we've just sort of gravitated towards this word troop. You just don't hear the term troops as often, I think, on somewhere like Mother Jones. They tend to be soldiers in some sense, for whatever reason. I mean, you would think this difference
Imperial death soldiers, I think, is what they call them.
That's right. I mean, you would think that the difference would be utterly innocuous. I mean, they're literally synonyms. Yeah. And yet, for whatever reason, when you hear the word troop, a different kind of cultural image comes to mind, a different kind of symbol comes to mind, versus when you hear the word soldier. And I have no idea why that's the case, but it's almost as if we've begun speaking different languages depending on which cultural group we feel like we belong to.
Yeah. All right. So final question to wrap this all up. I mean, we could do this all day, but I got 2 more interviews. So for all the people that hear you, that hear these ideas of classical liberalism, I'm thrilled that for the little bit that I've been doing the show these last couple of years, I feel like the phrase classical liberalism has come out a little bit. You hear it now in mainstream. It's nice. It's coming around. So for the people that want conversation, that want to not just impugn their intellectual opponents and that actually want conversation, all that stuff, what's the best method? You're around a lot of young people. You're teaching this stuff. What is, just because I get tons of email about this, what do I do if I want to be in the conversation and not smeared and maligned and all that stuff? What's the best way to march forward with this?
That's interesting, and actually, and just based on the conversation that we've had, I mean, I would, in some sense, stay off of social media, because at some level, classical liberalism it's a difficult doctrine as an individual. I think. I mean, it says, listen, at some level, you're responsible for your own views. At some level, you're responsible for exercising individual judgment. You aren't going to be just sort of spoon-fed a series of ideological signifiers that you can latch onto whenever you need them. You're going to have to adjudicate. You're going to have to read. You're going to have to think. You're going to have to be the kind of person who's capable of being responsible enough to be free. And so I would say, argue all you want to, debate all you want to, discuss all you want to, but I would do it in a way, I would do it in good faith. I would assume that whoever it is that you're talking to, that they have something to offer, that they're capable of changing their minds, that they're arguing with you in good faith, right? That they aren't merely running through a script of views that they already hold or something like that, and that you assume the same position. That you say, I could be wrong about this sort of thing. I haven't read everything. I haven't, there are limits to my own understanding, and I'm willing to explore those limits.
So the burden's on us.
The burden, well, absolutely.
We got the work cut out for us, right?
That's what freedom at some level it's about. Is that you as an individual are responsible for making your own way.
Yeah, I think that's a fitting ending to this conversation. For more on Professor Turner, check out learnliberty.org/speakers/Brandon-Turner.